What would you do if you dismissed your enemy's weapon as inferior and then that weapon destroyed you? Not because you were wrong about the weapon being inferior. You were right. Technically, your weapons were better. But you missed something crucial. You had 50 excellent weapons. Your enemy had 175 adequate weapons. And adequate deployed everywhere simultaneously beats excellent deployed carefully in small numbers. This is the story of how Japanese admirals looked at America's Fletcher-Class destroyer and saw nothing special. Standard displacement, standard guns, standard torpedoes. Nothing innovative, nothing threatening. Just another mass-produced American ship built by a country that valued quantity over quality. Then America built 175 of them in 3 years and deployed them everywhere simultaneously. Every invasion, every convoy, every battle, every island. Japanese forces turned around, and there was always a Fletcher. Sometimes 3 Fletchers. The ships Japanese admirals dismissed as unremarkable became the most successful destroyer class in naval history. They sank more enemy ships than any other destroyer class. They participated in every major Pacific battle. They were at Guadalcanal, Midway, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa, everywhere. This is about how mass production defeats craftsmanship, how being good enough everywhere beats being excellent somewhere, and why your enemy's boring solution sometimes works better than your brilliant innovation. The choice between perfecting a few ships and deploying adequate ships in overwhelming numbers determined who controlled the Pacific. And what happened when America chose quantity over quality still echoes through every debate about whether good enough is better than perfect. December 1941. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack devastates the American Pacific Fleet. Battleships sink or burn. The attack is tactically brilliant and strategically successful. In Tokyo, Japanese naval staff assess the damage and plan next moves. They're confident. Japan has the world's best destroyers, the Fubuki-class and later the Kagero-class. These ships are fast, heavily armed, and equipped with the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, the best torpedo in the world. American destroyers are inferior by comparison. Smaller, less heavily armed, equipped with torpedoes that frequently fail. Japanese destroyers have night-fighting capabilities American destroyers lack. In destroyer versus destroyer combat, Japanese ships win consistently. The early war proves this. At battles like Savo Island in 1942, Japanese destroyers savage American forces in night actions. But America is designing a new destroyer, the Fletcher-Class. The first keel is laid in October 1941 before Pearl Harbor. The design philosophy is simple. Build a destroyer that's good enough at everything, can be mass-produced quickly, and can perform multiple roles. Not the best destroyer, not the most innovative, just solid, reliable, versatile, and producible in huge numbers. The Fletcher design prioritizes practicality over perfection. 5 5-inch guns, powerful enough to hit aircraft, ships, or shore targets. 10 torpedo tubes, adequate for anti-ship combat. Depth charges, for anti-submarine warfare. Radar, for detection and fire control. Speed of 38 knots, fast enough for most missions. Range of 6,500 miles, adequate for Pacific distances. Crew of 273, small enough to be efficient, large enough to handle damage and sustained operations. When Japanese naval intelligence gets reports about Fletcher-class specifications, they're unimpressed. 5-inch guns are standard. American torpedoes are known to be unreliable. The ships displace 2,100 tons, smaller than Japanese destroyers which displace 2,500 tons. There's nothing revolutionary about the Fletcher design. It's just another American destroyer, and American destroyers have been losing to Japanese destroyers consistently. Japanese admirals file the Fletcher reports and focus on threats that matter. American carriers, which are the real danger. Destroyers are secondary, and Fletcher-class destroyers look particularly secondary. They're boring, unremarkable, not worth special attention. The first Fletcher-class destroyer, USS Nicholas, is commissioned in June 1942. By the end of 1942, 12 Fletcher-class destroyers are in service. By the end of 1943, 71. By the end of 1944, 131. By war's end, 175. America is building Fletcher-Class destroyers faster than Japan can track them, faster than Japan can sink them. The production rate is staggering. Multiple shipyards building simultaneously using standardized designs and mass production techniques. Keels laid, hulls welded, ships launched, fitting completed, commissioning ceremony, ship at sea, all in about 9 months from start to finish. Japan takes 18 months to build a comparable destroyer and builds them one at a time in carefully managed construction. America treats destroyers like cars on an assembly line. This mass production terrifies Japanese planners once they realize what's happening, but by the time they realize it, it's too late to counter. Here's what Fletcher-class destroyers do that Japanese planners didn't anticipate. They're everywhere. Need to screen carriers? Fletchers. Need to escort convoys? Fletchers. Need to bombard shore installations before an amphibious landing? Fletchers. Need to hunt submarines? Fletchers. Need to fight surface actions at night? Fletchers. Need picket duty to provide early warning of air attacks? Fletchers. The ships are versatile enough to handle any mission adequately. Not perfectly. Specialized ships might do each job better. But Fletchers can do all of them well enough. And there are so many Fletchers that you can assign them to every mission simultaneously. Japan has excellent specialized ships, but Japan doesn't have enough of them to be everywhere at once. So Japanese forces face situations where they have local superiority, better ships, better training, but can't exploit it because they're overwhelmed by numbers. Let me give you a specific example. November 1943, Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. An American task force of 4 cruisers and 8 destroyers, 4 of them Fletcher-class, faces a Japanese force of 4 cruisers and 6 destroyers. On paper, it's an even match. In practice, the American force has radar-directed fire control and superior coordination. The Fletcher-class destroyers USS Spence, Thatcher, Converse, and Foote launch torpedo attacks that sink 1 Japanese cruiser and damage several others. American gunnery, directed by radar, hits Japanese ships that can't see American ships in the darkness. The Japanese force retreats after losing 2 ships and having several damaged. American losses: 0 ships sunk, 2 damaged. This isn't because American destroyers are superior ship for ship. In daylight combat between equal numbers, Japanese destroyers might win. But American advantages in radar, numbers, and coordination overcome Japanese advantages in individual ship quality. This pattern repeats constantly. Japanese forces win some battles, but American forces win the war by showing up to every battle with adequate ships in overwhelming numbers. You can't be everywhere with 50 excellent destroyers. You can be everywhere with 175 adequate destroyers. And being present with adequate capability beats being absent with superior capability. Japanese planners understood this too late. By 1943, they're reporting to Tokyo. The Americans are building destroyers at a rate we cannot match. We sink their destroyers and more appear. We face Fletcher-class ships in every engagement. We cannot achieve local superiority because they achieve numerical superiority everywhere. Let's talk about the Fletcher design philosophy and why it worked. American naval architects made trade-offs that Japanese designers wouldn't make. Fletcher-class destroyers sacrificed some performance for reliability and producibility. Japanese destroyers were faster. Some could hit 40 knots compared to Fletcher's 38. Japanese torpedoes had longer range and bigger warheads. Japanese destroyers had more armor in some configurations, but Japanese destroyers were complex to build and maintain. They required skilled labor and specialized facilities. They took longer to construct. They were harder to repair in forward areas. Fletcher-class destroyers were simpler. They used standardized components that could be manufactured anywhere. They could be repaired by any naval facility with basic machine shops. They could be crewed by relatively inexperienced sailors who could be trained quickly because the systems were straightforward. This design philosophy, simple, reliable, producible, is unsexy. Naval architects want to design the best destroyer possible. Engineers want to push technological boundaries. Admirals want the most capable ships. But the Fletcher design team prioritized winning the war over winning design awards. They asked, what destroyer design can be built in huge numbers, operated by average crews, maintained in forward areas, and will be adequate for the missions we need? The answer was Fletcher. Not the best destroyer. The best destroyer for winning this specific war against this specific enemy, in this specific context. Here's a detail that illustrates the point. Fletcher-class destroyers use dual-purpose 5-inch guns. They could shoot at surface targets or aircraft. Japanese destroyers primarily had specialized guns, some for surface combat, different guns for anti-aircraft. The dual-purpose guns made Fletcher-class destroyers more flexible. One gun system, simpler logistics. Crews could shift between missions without retraining. This flexibility meant Fletchers could respond to threats opportunistically. See an enemy plane? Shoot it with the main battery. See an enemy ship? Shoot it with the same guns. See enemy shore installations? Same guns. Japanese destroyers with specialized armament had to choose their role before engagement. Once committed, they couldn't adapt as easily. Now let's talk about what Japanese sailors experienced facing Fletcher-class destroyers. At first, relief. These are the American destroyers we've been beating. Nothing special. Then confusion. Why are there so many of them? Then frustration. We sink one, two more appear. Then desperation. They're everywhere. We can't achieve local superiority anywhere because they achieve numerical superiority everywhere. A Japanese destroyer commander, interviewed after the war, described the experience. In 1942, we feared American carriers. In 1943, we feared American aircraft. By 1944, we feared American destroyers because they were everywhere and we were nowhere. You couldn't plan engagements anymore because no matter where you went, Fletcher-class destroyers were already there or arrived during combat. It was like fighting ghosts that multiplied. I want to pause and ask you something genuinely because I'm curious how different people think about this trade-off. If you were designing military equipment or designing any product, would you rather have the best possible product in limited numbers or a good enough product in unlimited numbers? There's no obviously right answer. It depends on context, but this trade-off appears constantly in business, war, technology, everything. Quality versus quantity. Excellence versus adequacy. Drop your answer in the comments with your reasoning, because I think how people answer reveals fundamental differences in strategic thinking, and I'm genuinely interested in the diversity of perspectives. The Fletcher-class versatility became legendary. These ships did everything. At Guadalcanal, they escorted supply convoys while fighting off aircraft and submarines. At Tarawa, they provided naval gunfire support for Marines landing on beaches. At Philippine Sea, they screened carriers during the largest carrier battle in history. At Leyte Gulf, they participated in the largest naval battle in history, fighting in surface actions, anti-aircraft defense, and anti-submarine warfare within the same 48-hour period. At Okinawa, they served as radar pickets, early warning stations positioned forward of the fleet to detect incoming kamikaze attacks. This role was incredibly dangerous. Picket destroyers absorbed kamikaze attacks that otherwise would have hit carriers. 15 Fletcher-class destroyers were sunk, most at Okinawa on picket duty. But their sacrifice protected the fleet. This willingness to use destroyers aggressively in high-risk roles came from abundance. When you have 175 destroyers, you can accept losses that would be unacceptable with 50 destroyers. This is brutal calculus, but strategically sound. Lose 5 destroyers protecting carriers and you've still got 170 destroyers. The carriers you saved are irreplaceable. The destroyers are replaceable. Another one will be commissioned next week. Japan couldn't think this way. Every destroyer lost was a gap that couldn't be filled. Japanese forces had to husband their destroyers, use them carefully, avoid risks. This caution meant Japanese destroyers weren't present at crucial moments. American destroyers were present everywhere because losing a few was acceptable if presence mattered. Let's talk numbers specifically because they're stark. America commissioned 175 Fletcher-Class destroyers between 1942 and 1945. In the same period, Japan commissioned 32 destroyers of all classes combined. America built more destroyers of one class than Japan built total, and America was simultaneously building other classes: the smaller destroyer escorts, the larger Gearing-class destroyers, submarines, cruisers, battleships, carriers. American industrial capacity was overwhelming. But this capacity needed good designs to be effective. The Fletcher design was perfect for mass production: standardized, simple, reliable. If America had designed complex destroyers that required specialized manufacturing, production would have been slower. The Fletcher design matched industrial capability to strategic need perfectly. Here's what happened by late 1944. Japan had lost most of its experienced destroyer crews. Replacements were undertrained. Japanese destroyers were increasingly used for transport missions, running supplies to isolated island garrisons, because Japan no longer had merchant ships available for this role. Destroyers designed for combat were being used as cargo ships. Meanwhile, American Fletcher-class destroyers were doing everything they'd been designed for and dominating every mission. By 1945, Japanese naval operations had effectively ended. The few remaining Japanese destroyers stayed in port because venturing out meant certain destruction. American Fletcher-class destroyers operated with impunity, bombarding the Japanese home islands, escorting carrier raids, hunting the last submarines. The post-war assessment is remarkable. Fletcher-class destroyers sank more enemy ships, submarines, destroyers, cruisers, transports, than any other destroyer class in any navy in World War II. They participated in every major Pacific battle. They earned more battle stars and unit citations than any comparable class. Their loss rate was about 8%, 15 sunk out of 175 commissioned, which is remarkably low for ships that fought continuously in high-intensity combat. Compare this to Japanese destroyer losses: over 60% destroyed. The Fletcher design philosophy of reliability and numbers proved decisively superior to the Japanese philosophy of quality and specialization. Here's the lesson that carries beyond naval warfare. Excellence in small quantities loses to adequacy in overwhelming quantities when the mission requires presence everywhere. If you can only be in one place, be excellent there. But if you need to be everywhere, be adequate everywhere, and let numerical superiority compensate for individual limitations. This applies to business. Is it better to have the best product in limited markets, or a good product in all markets? It applies to technology. Is it better to have cutting-edge features on limited devices, or adequate features on ubiquitous devices? It applies to warfare. Is it better to have elite units in key positions or adequate units everywhere? The Fletcher-class design influenced naval architecture for decades. Post-war destroyer designs incorporated Fletcher lessons: simplicity, reliability, versatility. The U.S. Navy kept Fletcher-class destroyers in service for decades. Some served in the Korean War. Some were transferred to Allied navies and served into the 1970s. The design was so sound that it remained relevant for 30 years, far longer than most warship classes. This longevity proves the design worked not just for World War II, but as a fundamental approach to destroyer design. Now let's talk about what didn't happen. America could have designed super destroyers, bigger, faster, more heavily armed than anything Japan built. American industrial capacity could have supported this. But super destroyers would have been more expensive, more time-consuming to build, more complex to operate and maintain. America would have built maybe 60 super destroyers instead of 175 Fletchers. Would 60 super destroyers have been better than 175 Fletchers? Almost certainly not. The missions that needed doing: convoy escort, carrier screening, amphibious support, anti-aircraft defense, anti-submarine warfare, required presence in multiple locations simultaneously. 60 ships can't be as many places as 175 ships. The missions didn't need super ships. They needed adequate ships in abundant numbers. This restraint, choosing adequate over excellent when adequate is sufficient, is difficult psychologically. Engineers want to build the best. Commanders want the best tools. But strategic thinking requires asking, what's sufficient for the mission? What can be produced in the numbers needed? What matches industrial capacity to strategic requirements? The Fletcher design answered these questions correctly. It was sufficient for all missions, producible in massive numbers, matched perfectly to what America could build and what the Pacific War required. There's a Japanese naval officer's observation from post-war analysis that captures this perfectly. He wrote, "We sought perfection in our ships. Americans sought sufficiency. We achieved perfection in small numbers. Americans achieved sufficiency in overwhelming numbers. Perfection multiplied by scarcity equals defeat. Sufficiency multiplied by abundance equals victory. We learned this lesson at great cost." This is a bitter recognition from someone who believed quality would overcome quantity. It didn't. Quantity properly deployed overcame quality. Here's what connects to decisions you make constantly. How often do you over-engineer solutions? How often do you pursue perfection when good enough would work and could be deployed faster, cheaper, more widely? This isn't advocating for mediocrity. This is advocating for matching solution quality to problem requirements. If the problem requires excellence, be excellent. But if the problem requires presence and scale, good enough deployed widely beats excellent deployed narrowly. The Fletcher-Class destroyer is the case study proving this point. Two stories are on your screen right now. One about another time mass production defeated craftsmanship, Sherman tanks versus German Tigers. One about a time when pursuing perfection led to disaster, German wonder weapons that came too late to matter. Watch both. See the pattern of adequacy at scale defeating excellence in scarcity. Because this pattern repeats constantly in war, business, technology, everything. The side that matches solution to problem requirements wins. The side that over-engineers or under-engineers loses. Thanks for watching this far and for thinking about trade-offs between quality and quantity, excellence and adequacy, perfection and sufficiency. If this story changed how you think about good enough versus perfect, hit that like button. Your engagement helps others find stories about strategic thinking and why the best solution isn't always the obvious solution. Subscribe if you want more history showing how wars are won by people who understand trade-offs between competing goods rather than people who pursue uncompromising excellence. The algorithm promotes engagement, so your comment or like helps someone else discover that maybe good enough deployed everywhere beats perfect deployed somewhere. See you in the next one, where we'll explore more moments when adequate at scale defeated excellent at scarcity and changed history.